today we're going to have 4 or 5 people join us who are different people who've worked in the field. We're focusing on informal community-based climate education. So informal and community-based or cultural institutions, depending on how you want to describe it. But it's really more what we historically had called informal education. But specifically within that, the next 3 clean calls, today's, July's, and August, we do the toward the end of the month, the clean calls all focused on ACE listening sessions. The first one's going to be on professional learning for educators or interpreters who are working there. So that's why this panel is there. There are 2 other panels that we're working on as well. So Anita Davis is a longtime colleague of mine back in my days at NOAA. So Anita, what is your current affiliation with Earth to Sky?
So I'm co-leading with Genevieve de Messier, and Genevieve is lead. She's taken the reins and doing a fabulous job. I am now working a 30-hour instead of a 60-hour work week. So, but very much enjoying continuing to keep my finger in the pie.
Fantastic.
So that's my current situation.
Genevieve, can you say your name, because I am just so bad at this, and because you are now the current lead, as Anita just alluded to, for the Earth to Sky Interagency Partnership. So please.
Thanks, Frank. So I'm Genevieve de Messier, and I've been learning so much from Anita and the rest of the team and the rest of the community. I'm really excited to be working with all of you on this initiative.
Fantastic. And Lee, is it Peak? Is that how you say it?
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. Rarely do I get them right. So when I do, woohoo. So you're the Chief Education Officer at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, or GMRI. So thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
And did Bart Merrick make it on yet? Oh, Bart. Well, let's see. I don't see him yet. So we're just going to keep on moving. And Billy Spitzer was the principal investigator for NOCI, or the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation, and former Vice President of Learning and Community at the New England Aquarium. So Billy, thank you very much for joining us in your retired capacity.
Not retired, but pausing, but yes, thank you.
In your paused capacity.
You caught me before I'm about to go off for 2 weeks up into the backwoods of Maine. So happy to be here.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you for making the time. So I do want to acknowledge, this is a new slide for these listening sessions because I think it's really important. We are recording this. There will be a transcript. If you want to change your name for whatever reason, you can change your name to anything. It will make it hard as we look through these contributions in the chat and also in what is said to trace back what is said to an individual. But you have every right to either leave, this is recorded, or to make yourself anonymous. You can change your name in what's seen. Zoom captures the name and what's said. So if you wanted to make that anonymous, you have that right. So I just want to make sure that we're all clear on proper protocols. We will be looking back over these in a research capacity. So other things to consider is that with this work about ACE, which is about, education, training, public access, public awareness, public participation, and collaboration around how those modalities support climate action. It's an international framework. This is now being, we're looking at the national level or across our country, but in that work, obviously justice is a critical piece to look at the causes of inequity and how we can remove those inequities. Inclusion, because we have so many important perspectives and contributions that we want to be as inclusive to all those groups and individuals who have the absolute right to participate in this work and framing it and driving it and contributing and benefiting from it. And then obviously we have to do this respectfully. Of all the contributions that come from those diverse voices and perspectives and backgrounds and contributions, we want to make sure that they're all respected and credited and So just hold that as we go through this process. We're continuing to move forward this agenda. This really started formally back in October, where we committed to developing we need a plan. We know these strategies are so important, but we don't have a uniting plan. We saw the ACE framework as a really important way of bringing all this amazing work that comes across our country and beyond into more strategic alignment and possibility as we go forward. So there's a lot of steps in this process. The listening sessions are really to get a deeper understanding of what are those inputs that should be taken into the planning process. The release of the dialogues for this actually just went out last hour. And we'll be more about that in the clean listserv. So look for that. There's a lot of invitations, but then there's also network people who want to contribute to that. So look for that. Just taking a little bit of a step. These are the steps that ACE requires in their guidelines for developing a national strategy. All countries are supposed to develop these. No major emitting country has developed one of these yet. But let's also take a moment to reflect back on those check marks are just my graphic way of saying that we've actually, as a community, in a variety of ways, done amazing substantive work across the last decade and a half. A lot of the programs that we're going to be talking about here, or the professionals, have been deep at this work for a very long time. So it's not like we don't have a strong conceptual basis. We have some established coordination structures. We have looked at cross-sector partnerships for implementation. So we've done pieces of this, but we've never united it. So that's really why, where we are. We've identified critical partner audiences. And this is we didn't used to have this, but I mean, clearly youth is a critical piece, workforce is a critical piece, community education is a critical piece, formal, informal, indigenous frontline communities and business leaders, all of those within our audience structures, based on some of the excellent work that's been done in our community. So format of the listening sessions is the following. So then I'm almost at the end of the introduction, and we'll go into a panel discussion. We use the same I'm wondering whether the questions needed to change more than they do, but they are. The protocol is a protocol. So we're going to keep on rolling with it. And we have not gotten to those questions of 10 minutes. So as people who are participants, not the panelists, have questions, Tamara Ledley will be facilitating the dialogue in the chat. I'm not going to be looking at chat until after. I always look after because I can't do it while I'm facilitating the conversation. But know that what you put in there will either it's on the record of these dialogues. It goes into possibly some people who are panelists can actually facilitate, talking and chatting. I can't. But we haven't gotten those questions yet. So put them in the chat. We'll retroactively go through them. And then, so the contributions will be really with the panelists today. If you have any announcements as a clean member and you want to make sure others in the network, put them in the chat, and then we'll deal with them through there. Okay, that's basically the structure. And I hear a barking dog, so hopefully that's not too bad. So, here, just let me close that door. All right, so, I think that we're gonna focus on professional learning related to informal, cultural-based, community-based education. So, first question. So, obviously, Billy, you recognize this photograph, but why is informal, community-based education, climate education, key for supporting climate action? It's a loaded question. It's a little awkward question, but really what we're looking at is what are the unique contributions of informal, community-based, cultural-based institutions' contributions to supporting their communities and looking at climate action. So that's the opening question. Anybody of our panelists can go forward first. So what do you guys think?
I'm happy to jump in if no one else is.
Go for it, Billy.
Okay, so
we're gonna be just dynamically going, guys.
Sounds good. you know, when we talk about informal education, we're talking about the 95% of people's lives that they spend outside of a formal school. So it's a really massive aspect of people's experience and how they learn. And particularly in the US, it's a really, really huge sector with something like 1,500 informal science venues across the country that have a huge reach. You know, something like upwards of 150 million visits a year. That's not people, but it's more visits. And they're also a sector in which people place a lot of trust in terms of where they're going to get their information and where they trust their information. And, you know, the sector includes everything from aquariums, zoos, science centers, natural history museums, you know, and I'd say even more broadly these days, cultural, you know, institutions more broadly, art museums and, you know, history museums also are addressing issues like climate change. They're institutions that have a lot of interpretive expertise in how to translate science so it's meaningful and salient and understandable for the public. And also informal learning, whether it happens at an institution or happens in other ways through the internet, social media, film, etc., tends to be really needs driven. You know, it's driven by the needs and interests of those learners who are engaged. So it really is very important in that way in terms of the users play a really important role in terms of deciding what they want to learn, how they want to learn it. And also it tends to really promote much more discourse as opposed to simply transmission of information. And in an issue like climate where there's this kind of abundance of information, but not necessarily an abundance of understanding, an abundance of engagement, discourse, action, you know, I think the informal sector has really a lot to offer. So that's like a quick summary of some of the ways that I think about why the sector is so important.
Others?
I'll go. I mean, it's always hard to follow Billy because he always gets it spot on. But I would also say, at least for us, in a space like a free choice informal environment, one of the nice things is they're choosing to be there and they're choosing to engage in what you have to offer. In our space, which is little less of that sort of free choice, we don't work the climate message in among a bunch of other messages. They're sort of signing on to come to an informal experience around climate. It's more the style of the engagement, the sort of playfulness, as opposed to lecture or something else that I think is really impactful, that they take risks in their learning and with their learning that they're not willing to take in other formats. So they'll, you know, mess around with maps of sea surface temperature change and species range in a way that they wouldn't if they were sitting in a lecture about that topic. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about how do we leverage that willingness to take risks with one's learning and to be playful in order to engage in what is obviously a really kind of serious topic.
Right.
Billy and Lee, really well said. That all makes a lot of sense to me. I agree with it. In some areas, I'd say informal spaces are possibly the only way for students and the public to engage with climate science. It's not part of the curricula of all school systems. And when it is, it can sometimes be limited in scope in the curriculum or sometimes not interdisciplinary. So there's opportunities to engage with this topic in informal spaces. Furthermore, there's these learning environments like parks or nature centers can often be a great place to connect what is happening with climate on a global scale to what people can see around them locally. So of course that can happen in schools too, but it's informal learning environments I think are particularly well suited to that. And gotcha. Anita, if you're, if you can, I'd love for you to share what you were saying about the power of interpretation.
Sure, hang on. Making sure I'm not muted. Sure. So I think that interpreters are in a unique and powerful position to facilitate civic and civil dialogue on issues of importance to society. People coming to interpretive programs are a pretty diverse audience, quite typically, in almost all of these treasured and conserved locations, whether they're, in a museum, a science center, an aquarium, or a park. People come to, I think, with their minds a little bit more open to hearing new ideas or certainly new knowledge. So taking advantage of that opportunity, and now with interpretation moving more and more into facilitated dialogue and open-ended questioning, it provides a platform for civil discourse that really is otherwise lacking in our society. There's not other places, I don't think, where people come together who are from such disparate backgrounds and then find a place that's of common for them, for their heart, that they love this place, or they fall in love with that aquarium animal, or they're really intrigued by this particular display or program. So to me, it's a very powerful position, and I don't think that any other group has that ability, really, that opportunity that interpreters have. The other thing is that interpreters and informal educators work with a broad array of audiences. So they're not just working with the public to come and visit them, but they're also oftentimes working with formal educators. They work with community leaders in their surrounding communities who are seeking collaborative solutions to problems in their region. And they also will work with youth, directly with youth, and not just youth leaders, but with youth themselves who come to those locations for volunteer positions or for learning. So I think they're really, to me, they're sort of at the crux of things when it comes to discussion in our country. I know I'm very biased by that, but I really feel that very strongly. And I second everything that everybody else said.
So Anita, one point that I know you've made in past conversations and work we did together was the scale of parks. I mean, it's one of the structures that we tend to forget in this conversation, and yet the annual visitorship in parks, it's rather substantial, if I remember right.
Yeah, it's more than all of the sports nationwide every year. It's akin to the quote that you will hear about museums and science centers. So it's enormous.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't have the most recent figure at the top of my head. I can get it for you. When you combine that with refuge visitation, it's kind of off the charts. So you have huge impact there.
So I think what it does is it sets up the really, given we're talking about informal. So let's just go to the next slide, right? Which is, because there's a couple dimensions to this, right? Which is, since we're looking at the professional learning, and I remember early on that this is actually a critical piece of activating this sector's ability, right? Because if those interpretive educators and docents and aren't skillful and comfortable in this work, you're going to get a very different potential. So how can climate change education and professional learning related to whether it's education, engagement, empowerment, support the development of inclusive, equitable climate solutions in communities. And I guess one thing is I remembered back to one of the points I think Anita you had just made. It's also inclusive communities is also rural in this space. I don't know if that's an important dimension of this, but I think that your institutions are very geographically dispersed across our very diverse country. So how can this happen?
Well, I'll just follow up with that because you were talking a little bit about parks there, and parks also are located in urban areas, and same thing is true with refuges. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has an urban refuge initiative, and so they're working specifically on trying to reach underserved communities in those urban areas.
Right.
But for our project, for what Earth to Sky is doing in educating informal educators, is to make sure that we're including inclusivity and diversity and equity in our own training and in our discussion sessions that we hold with our community. So that's one very active way that we can and do that. We can also work hard to include diversity in our participant pool. And we've been working a little harder at that more recently as we're launching this sort of regional approach that we have. We have one particular region's leadership is Native American. And so because that group is a specific and unique group to be reaching, I mean, Native American, Native people, it's really wonderful to have that perspective within that regional leadership. We'd like to increase that. So one thing we can do is to require or certainly challenge our new regions as they form teams to include diversity in their teams. And then when they run their regional courses, to make sure that they're addressing that there too. Those are sort of concrete methods.
Gotcha.
But I think too, if we collectively across the nation are addressing multiple levels of engagement, and by that I mean we have sort of a national scale things, and we have regional scale things, we have local scale things, we have individual parks, individual museums, and so forth. That will help us to be more diverse and inclusive as well.
Right.
So those approaches.
Great. Lee, you were going to jump in here?
Yeah, I don't have to. Somebody else had something to say, but I guess the things that came to mind is specifically around educating educators and interpreters. The first is for the informal educators that we work with, we see a terrible amount of insecurity about talking about climate change. You know, I mean, I think they're really afraid they're going to say something wrong or something that's scientifically inaccurate or that used to be accurate but now has been proven different or whatever. And so that feeling of being on point as the expert in the moment for something that is so challenging to keep up with, that's changing and evolving. So that would be point one. I think the other thing is that informal institutions, and I wrote something in the chat about libraries, we're trying to help other informal institutions see themselves primarily as a place of convening and conversation rather than necessarily the delivery of expertise, because that just puts you on the spot in a way that you may not want to be.
Yep.
And then the third thing that was inspired by what Anita said was, I think one of the real powers of informal institutions is the spontaneity of what turn out to be teachable moments, right? So someone's standing there, they're looking at a NOAA Science on a Sphere, and they're really kind of just hanging around with their kids, but they observe something or they ask a question, and that teachable moment is there and in an informal space in a really special way, and helping informal educators feel comfortable capitalizing on that question and leading it into a space of discussion around climate change, I think can also be just super powerful.
Right. Others?
Well said, Lee.
Go.
One thing I've
Please.
been learning more is how long it takes to build these relationships in order to bring people in. So it's good when planning programs, budgeting, writing up metrics for a success, and developing expectations. It's good to expect this to take time. It depends on the community, of course, but when reaching out to a community, it's important to consider, why are you reaching out to them? What do you, is there something that you would like to learn from them, or that you would like them to help other communities with? Is there something that a resource that you think that might be useful to them? And I think it's especially important to examine our motivations and make sure that they're not extractive, because so often when we engage with marginalized groups, the default mode in Western science is often to be extractive, And a lot of us come from that tradition. And so it's easy to fall into those patterns. So expect it to take time. Building trust takes time. And be really clear about what you are trying to get out of it. Are you asking for them to help educate others? Are you hoping to bring something to them? Are you hoping to co-build something together?
Really important contribution. Thank you. Billy, do you have anything else to add here?
Yeah, just a couple of quick things, both on kind of the sort of asset side and kind of the challenge side. I think on the asset side, you know, informal institutions tend to be really place-based, which is a real strength. So in terms of being able to localize, you know, what's happening with climate and climate solutions, I think there's a lot of potential. I think informal science institutions also tend to be really good at convening, as was said, and also at partnering. And they, you know, they do have, you know, in general, an interpretive, you know, kind of educational staff capacity. A couple of things on that sort of challenge side is that simply being place-based doesn't necessarily mean that you're tightly connected and responsive to your community. So I think, you know, establishing really strong engagement and partnership arrangements with community organizations, you know, other organizations around you as an institution is really important and challenging and not always done well. Sometimes done, I think, as was said, in kind of an extractive mode or sort of an outreach mode. Here's the great things we have to offer. We will provide them to you, as opposed to a more genuine kind of partnership. Also, I think when you look across the country at the different kinds of institutions there are, in a way, there are kind of two tiers, I would say. There's kind of a tier of larger institutions, of which there are a smaller number that tend to reach a lot of people and get a lot of attention. But there are tons of smaller institutions, whether they're smaller parks or nature centers or science centers. And I think the professional associations have kind of plugged into the need to serve those two different groups somewhat differently. So when we think about what the capacity is, I think that's really important. And then a final thing I would say is that different institutions have a different degree of comfort, I would say, with where they fall on the just the facts versus kind of policy and advocacy work. And I think that climate is not a neutral issue. And so I think that it's really important for institutions to understand and kind of really think through, like, well, what their engagement looks like on an issue like climate. It's not, I don't think it can end up being simply about, you know, here's the science and stop there. And I think a lot of institutions, you know, I'd say in the zoo and aquarium world with a conservation mission have really address that more, and I think I've seen it less in general in kind of the science center world, you know, with exceptions on both sides. But I think that is also really important. You know, what does real engagement and empowerment look like? You know, is a really important question.
Gotcha. Awesome points. I'm going to keep going because we'll be here all day long if we keep at this rate. But you know, so how the question is, Anita, if you're not seeing it, is how can we better engage a diversity of local leaders and partners? We've already talked about this through informal community-based climate education professional learning for the millions of learners across the thousands of communities. So this is really about scale, right? Because I mean, I think, you know, one of the things I've noticed is that we do a lot of projects. I mean, the last round of NOAA, NASA, NSF money, you know, there's lots of small initiatives across the way, both as Billy and Anita both alluded to. We're talking about very large number of institutions reaching very large number of audience members and visitors. How do we do this at scale? What's different about how we work at scale than as opposed to the way we did it in 2008, 9, 10, 11, which is we gave a lot of small grants out across pockets, and it was very, you know, 1,000 flowers. But, you know, the field has a lot of grass still, you know, there's a lot of grass, not just flowers. I don't know if that analogy worked, but I hope you get my point. you guys think?
Well, I'll just jump in real quick. I mean, I'm a big believer in building networks, and that's kind of a lot of the work that I've been involved in, and really building the connections across institutions. And, the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation, which I've been involved in, has close to 200 institutions across the country involved across the spectrum of different kinds of organizations. Earth to Sky sort of similarly has a whole ton of organizations that are really working together and really working on joint communication strategies and interpretation strategies. And I think that that's where there's a lot of power. It's not like there's a standard curriculum across, every museum, it's not, but there is this potential because all these institutions are generally not competing with one another. They are willing to share ideas and resources and really come together to overcome some of the common challenges. So I think that's one of the ways you get to scale, is really think about networking, whether it's on a regional level or a national level. And I think there's a lot of good examples, both on the regional scale. I think of Change Scale out in the Bay Area, and a number of organizations have done that on the national level.
Gotcha. Others?
I remember at the workshop last December, what month is it?
Yes.
This was, I think, a topic that resonated quite a lot in that workshop. And I remember someone saying, we need the glue and we need to fund the glue. We need to fund and organize a sort of central, I guess a central structure to support this work. So that we can get organized around a set of cohesive objectives that we can all contribute to. Maybe the different organizations would only contribute to some subset of the objectives, but together we can contribute to all of them, and they need to be measurable objectives.
Awesome.
Obviously the other thing that we learned working in so many rural communities was kind of adaptability to the methods at hand in a way that we typically won't. Like I am totally guilty of we're going to develop this and we're going to push it out. So one is the point that I think that Jen made around co-development with communities or handing of the authority. But also, we had a lot of communities who basically said, put it on public access TV. That's the only way we actually can absolutely guarantee that everybody can get it if you're depending on broadband, So it's just that notion about what is the delivery mechanism that's already in place, whether it's a Rotary Club meeting or whatever, rather than us creating a brand new network for our little thing kind of method.
Gotcha. That's a really important contribution. Thank you, Lee. Anita, you have anything more you want to add to this point that hasn't already been said?
Well, I think people have said it well, but I think we're all kind of talking about, in some sense, a network that's needed. The structure of that network is, who knows exactly what it would be. I come from national park background, and I always go back to that in my heart and mind. And I think to me, there's an analogy of when you're working in a really big park, and there's all these different sites in the park where they might be independently supervised. I think about Grand Canyon because that's where I worked longest. And so there's a South Rim, and then it was divided up into districts along the South Rim. And each district had a component of the overall story. And it all came together. If you were a visitor, you would maybe see the village area, and then you might go out to the Western Drive or out to Desert View. So you would get part of the story of Grand Canyon in one place, another part of the story in another place, but your whole experience with you got in Grand Canyon. And every place gave you some sense of the significance of that park. And I think about any of these kinds of scale-up kinds of things in a similar sort of way. Each little place has a piece of that story. The job of that place, in addition to telling its little story, is to support the bigger story. And if a network can help to achieve that, then I think we really strengthen the overall approach. And you could maybe even figure out some ways to quantify some of it. You can't manage all of those tiny little things. There's no way to do it, nor would it be productive to do so. But trying to have some sort of overarching goals and objectives that everybody can find their piece that contributes to, that's the sort of view that makes sense to me.
Gotcha. Thank you. You know, there's a segue to this next question. You know, what's needed? Because given we're talking about professional learning, and Lee, I'm coming back to your point about a lot of the informal educators you work with are feeling kind of like I'm not prepared, I'm cautious, I could trip up easily, I could blow my trust, which is something you definitely don't want to do in the professional capacity you're in. But what's needed for, you know, businesses, levels of government, NGOs, education groups to provide coordinated support for professional learning on, you know, climate change, you know, empowerment across the nation, right? But that support, you know, it's not a trivial thing to help a educator, an interpreter become skillful and comfortable on this topic. It's not trivial. And we're talking about a large number. So, you know, but this is just your opportunity to talk about what's needed based on everything we've done to date. What's needed to make that happen? Floor is open.
Frank, just a clarifying question. You're asking,
Sure.
What do informal institutions or professional learning need from the communities around them in order to be successful in this work?
I think
Okay.
the reason why I add all these other elements is because, you know, because the next question is going to be about funding, right? And that's clearly a piece of this. But I don't think that that's the only input into this process. I think, you know, Billy already alluded to it. So it's what are all these other entities able to do to support these institutions in their professional learning? That's really the nut of the question.
I mean, funding is definitely a big part of that, so I'm looking forward to getting to that part of it.
But it's not the only piece of the puzzle, right? I mean, you know, because
no, it's not. I think, you know, to me, there's a couple of things. I think we have these different kinds of projects and programs out there. A number of them are highly successful. Some way to keep those things going on a sustained basis, and for those groups to be able to share with each other their successes, their methodology, the things that they tried and didn't work out so well, challenges they have. Just a forum for that would be, I think, really helpful and would help to move the whole field ahead. And I think back to when we had those PI meetings, you know, with the NSF, NOAA, and NASA. I found those meetings to be really productive because of the exchange of knowledge that was going on there with the PIs. And it was so sad to see that come to an end, really, because I think it was really right on the cusp of, it was like one more meeting and we're going to start to see coalescing around various effective methodologies and so forth. And we just didn't quite get that far. But I think an effort that would help to move that forward, even if it was just an annual meeting, might really help. But some form of a structure that allows that kind of exchange from the people who are leading or highly active in some of those ongoing projects and programs.
Yeah,
and obviously, that kind of effort would need to be funded.
Right, but it's a different kind of project, right? Because I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting, Earth to Sky, you received funding through that, and Noki was created because of that, but you've been able to figure out how to keep going without the same funding. And I think that one of the principles we're looking for here is that this is long work, and that it takes a long time to figure out the right way to do it, and it takes a long time to figure out the right methodologies to do it, and it also takes a long time to build the name so you can be relied on to do it. So I think that there's an enduringness of this work that is probably a critical element that that's what I'm hearing. So,
I would agree with that, Frank. I think sustained efforts are really needed. They're also challenging to get funded. Most of our
we're going to get to
funding-
that in a second.
Yeah, but I get that, but what I'm saying is that it's because of that, it tends to be people who are stubborn, like me, who, you know, by hook or by crook, you're going to keep that thing going, even when you're lacking funding. You're figuring out a way to keep the notion moving forward. Those sustained efforts then do build community, do build success over time. So yeah, I think that's really a critical piece, and some way of having that central organizational fabric, whatever it is, have sustained funding. So it's not a 3-year funded effort from some grant. It has some longevity to it. And yeah, and I don't know, I don't know how you make that happen, but I think that's the real need.
Well, the first step in making it happen is you name it. If we don't talk about it, then we're never going to make progress on it. So if there's, so, you know, Lee, you had something to add.
Yeah, but I think Billy did too, and he hasn't. Did you want to jump in, Billy?
Oh, I could jump in real quick. I think one of the real challenges is that this whole effort of public engagement, from the point of view of sort of the policy sector and people who are in government and business, it's almost like invisible. People think of it as like, oh, we got to get it in the school curriculum. Well, that's one piece that's important, but this whole idea of true public engagement is really, I think, not well understood and isn't given a high priority. Yet there is a lot of evidence base behind how important public civic participation is on an issue like climate or any really critical policy issue. And I think a lot of the folks who were involved at the more kind of regional and local level in sustainability and climate resilience and so on, they think of maybe outreach as something that needs to happen to tell people what they need to do, as opposed to really engaging people as citizens who have an investment. And I think that is a really critical role that the informal education community can help support, but it's just not recognized. So I think that has to happen prior to making the case for funding. Is, you have to actually have it be recognized. And I think that really coalescing that evidence base and making it more visible and so on could be really important. And then figuring out a way to kind of coordinate and professionalize some of this work on a more national level is also really important. Yet a lot of it is going to happen on the local level. So it's like the implementation has to happen locally and be very locally tailored and probably locally supported, but you need some kind of national infrastructure that is more operational and ongoing than has been the case.
Gotcha. Thank you. Lee?
This may be a little bit more challenging in the sense that I was sitting here thinking about, we all just radically changed our lives in a response to the pandemic. The government just handed out $1 trillion without blinking an eye. We all rearranged our lives for anti-racism work in the last few weeks. So some of it, I think, is on us to just have some audacity to believe that all of these institutions would come along with us. I think sometimes I get in a rut of waiting for funding or asking for permission or waiting until some coalition happens, right? And I think sometimes you have to reverse that and say, just have the audacity to believe that it can be that important to everybody else and act as if.
Right. It's an important point, Lee. Others? Any other contributions here? Good. I imagine you want to get to the funding question. So we are looking at 45. So here we are.
I just wanted to say also, there's some really great discussion happening in the chat about the issues of scaling up and how to prioritize local efforts. And I'm really appreciating what I'm seeing there.
Yeah, we're up to 67 chats. So I mean, whatever we're doing in the panel is triggering, and plus the people who are here, there's a very active chat, and I'm not looking at it, but we will be bringing that back in and informing the wider conversations here. So, but Lee, I just want to honor what you just said. That's a really interesting observation, right? That funding, as we go into the funding question, that funding has the priority can generate movement, but maybe the movement of what we need to do professionally doesn't only rely on funding, as you know, the carrot isn't always what we focus on, right? I've noticed that, and I think that the two examples you just gave are huge disruptions that are still reverberating through our institutions, both negatively and positively. But
Yeah.
so let's just get into this question, right? So I want to make sure we don't run out of time here, but it's a critically important. I've heard this so many times, that if we don't get the funding right, not just how much, but how. And it's also, but notice it's an important issue. How best should we increase or prioritize, right? Meaning that a lot of the institutions that we're talking to already have funding. So it's not just about getting new money to do new additional work. It's also how do you restructure your core work to maximize the power and potential of ACE for Climate Empowerment programs focused on, professional learning for informal education. Basically, that's the gist of the question. So what do you think? We've already touched on some of this, but what else has to be said here on this point?
If we were able to accomplish having a central organization leading this effort and have some central objectives that we're all contributing to that are measurable, it would also be essential for this organization to be well funded, and ideally to have a pot of money that could be dispersed out to various efforts in order to help organizations large and small meet these goals. For example, to help support travel to a training workshop when when their organization would not be able to pay for it, or perhaps they're not part of an organization in the way that our funding organizations often assume that participants are. Like maybe they're a retiree or they're a youth or something like that, and they don't have that funding support that we so often assume for professional development training.
Sure.
There's a lot of other things we could accomplish with such a funding pot as well, like seed money for local and regional efforts to accomplish their goals, like putting on training workshops.
Right.
I would just say one of the real issues, I think, with a lot of informal education institutions, and very much so with a lot of community organizations, is that they tend to operate on really thin margins. And when stressed by things like the pandemic, for example, I mean, I think a lot are not going to necessarily come back. I think many will, but so I think one of the challenges, particularly in community partnership work between larger institutions and smaller institutions, is that issue of maintaining equity and balance in that relationship. And I think that there is kind of this tension between, on the one hand, sort of providing funding to large institutions that have a large reach versus supporting kind of smaller, real community-driven efforts. And I think that issue of equity is something that needs to be kind of better understood and addressed. And I'm not sure exactly how that should play out in the funding, but I think that is something that I think is a real issue, particularly if we want to focus on broadening participation of the public in this work. So I think that on the one hand, I think we need funding to advance the evidence base, to provide support for training, to provide support for people who are doing the work, to sort of fuel the engine of kind of continuous improvement of the practice. And at the same time is we need some way so that local efforts don't, for example, like youth-based grassroots efforts don't get left out of this work.
Right. There's one dimension that I hadn't appreciated until there's this moment. There's in NOAA, we give out grants in this area. Lee, you're funded by it. Billy, you were funded by it with the NOAA Environmental Air Scan program. But it's an arduous task to manage those large federal grants. Thank you for the head. It's a massive amount of work to get those grants. And there's a lot of institutions that just don't, they have great work. They should be able to, but they just don't have the enterprise that supports the getting these dollars. And so there's an inequity there that is something that we have to carry forward here. How you structure the programs and how much work it is to get them for not a lot of money, a lot of work and a lot of money. We have to figure that out. So sorry I broke my facilitator role, but I think it builds on what you said, Billy, but it adds a little more technical structure to with your points, I hope. Any other funding related reprioritization of funds?
I mean, my
Anything
colleagues.
Let's go with Lee and then Anita.
I'll say it really quickly, just that I think my colleagues would kill me for saying this, but we have been at our best when forced by a funding agency to demonstrate strong collaborations with community-based organizations, right? So there's a few NSF proposals out now where you have to clearly demonstrate that you've co-developed the proposal with the community-based organization. Responding to what you said, Frank, I think if they could have, they would have flowed the money through the community-based organization, but knowing that they can be hard to manage, et cetera, this is another lever. I would say we're at our best in those projects, but they're also few and far between because they are very hard to make happen. But they force us to kind of reach in a different kind of way. So yeah, that's very important.
That's very important, Lee, because especially this work, I think is
right.
uniquely drives that type of intersectionality between the different yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Enough said. Anita?
I was just going to ask a question, and I don't want this to sound somehow like competition between government and non-government, because it's not the notion here. But when you create this sort of coordinated support thing, whatever it is, I think it has to be one of three things, and correct me if I'm wrong. I think it either has to be government, non-government, or a public-private partnership. And the reason I bring this up is when you start talking about funding, it's kind of a different bag of tricks when you're inside an agency versus when you're outside of an agency, and how it all works. And I think that's a component of whatever structure gets developed. It has to be well thought out and well considered, because fortunately for me, my project ended up being funded by an agency. Originally, it was grant funded. There's a big difference in the way I can approach things as a result, right? So I just bring that up as a sort of a question. I'm not sure that what an answer might be, but I think we really need to think that through.
Anita, thank you for that point, because there's lots of different structures of funding. And I think that we have to look at all the structures, and then what are the ways that those resources can actually support. I mean, at the end of the day, this is about supporting those educators who are on the interface between public and in an institution or a geography. So yeah, wonderful. Now we've got about 5 minutes left. Of course, we blew our question and answer time. I'm sure in those 90 chats, there's probably a lot of richness there. Thank you for calling it forward. But so what else? This question's a catch bag question, right? What else have we not talked about that should be considered or explored? What else? Anything else in this space that is, we're going to look at community engagement in July, and then, more programs, exhibits that cultural institutions, informal education institutions in August. So hopefully you come back and join us for those, because you're not just on the professional learning side of the equation. But what else? Anything else that needs to be said, thought through, put forth that has not been said?
I had a thought on that. I was wondering if there are allies to this movement who we don't have at the table yet that we should be including, particularly in thinking about, are we missing entire professions that we could be working with? Civil engineers, landscape architects, urban planners, and should we be working more with the energy sector? Are there science topics or initiatives that are closely aligned to what we're doing in climate that might help us reach broader audiences? I mean, I'm a birder, I love birding, so talk about invasive species and bird strikes on buildings, and I'm interested in that is connected to climate too, but it's sort of adjacent.
Gotcha.
I'm sure
Thank
there are
you.
many others.
Of
Yeah,
course.
I would add two. One is, you know, all of this informal education work takes place in a context that we're surrounded by media, whether it's broadcast media, social media, et cetera. And I think better coordination across those sectors could be really, really beneficial. Another sector that I think is really important is the public health sector, which is, I think, one of the few kind of professional areas where they've kind of figured out a model for, at least until recently, I'd say, you know, a model where you can have national level work and also a lot of very deeply community-based work that happens at a local and regional level. You know, so you have a CDC, but you also have all these public health departments. That system has been weakened in the last few years, and I think we've seen some of the impacts of that, but it is an potentially incredibly strong and robust system and a way for dealing with something that's, you know, science-based, policy, you know, relevant, and is happening both at a very local level and a much broader level.
You know, Billy, one of the interesting things I've noticed in my just living in my community is that they also have the ability to educate us
Absolutely.
everywhere. Like you walk into Starbucks to get something and there's a sign that they've generated that Starbucks has put on their window that is for you to learn about what, you know, that is different. They've pushed out the modalities of engagement into the community in a much more expansive way than what we historically have been able to do, right? You know, come to our place and we'll educate you, as opposed to that education goes out into the community in a much more robust way. So I'm right with you. That's awesome. What else? We got 2 minutes left. I'm going to keep us to our time. I want to respect your time, and I need to, you know, close the meeting in 2 minutes. So
the only other thing is another sector, which is really, we started working more with almost the sort of venture capital side of the sector to sort of say, they're in conversations every day with entrepreneurs who are trying to invent green tech, et cetera, and they're willing to do those investments in ways that are not as high. They're more impact investment or social impact, you know, and so is that a place where a lot of us nonprofits sort of stay away from, and maybe actually pulling them closer could be really impactful.
that's interesting. I think, you know, there's probably lots of us doing these different innovations. And so, you know, the bright spot analysis and then the ripple effects, you know, looking at those ways, like how does this innovation in one spot move across? If it's successful, how does it move across and inform other practice? So wonderful. I did put up on the screen that if you're specifically interested in contributing and listening, this is a quiet listserv, but you know, it's going to get more active starting in August. And building across the year. So I would sign up for this listserv if you're interested in just following this specific thread about building an East national strategy within the United States.